feels like an understatement, I think, to say that Parasite was a big deal. Like, I still remember walking out of the movie theater and being like, where can I get more of this kind of movie? Well, I will tell you where. Director Bong Joon Ho's follow-up to Parasite is out. It's called Mickey 17. It's quite something. The group chat's here. Let's get into it. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Honestly, I think the feeling that I remember after Parasite is like this feeling of just pure satisfaction of like, oh, that was everything that a movie is supposed to do. You just kind of felt like you were watching great cinema, and then it kind of helped that it won 4 Oscars. It won Best Picture, made history doing so because it was the first non-English movie to win Best Picture. So with all that attention, there are also obviously a lot of expectations, particularly on the director, Bong Joon Ho, and his follow-up movie. Well, that is now out. It's called Mickey 17. And it is the #1 movie at the box office. Michelle Cho is here. Jackson Weaver is here. They're ready to talk about this movie. What's up, y'all? Welcome to the show. Nice to see you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, of course. Listen, Jackson, we're going to talk about the movie in just a moment, but I think it may be worth just starting with a conversation about Bong Joon Ho. I want to play you a clip. He was on Stephen Colbert recently promoting the movie.
The latest film is Mickey 17. It's based on the novel Mickey 7. Why did you add 10 more Mickeys?
그 넘버가 사실 죽는 횟수를 말하는 거거든요. 네.
So the number indicates how many times he's had to die?
So I kill him 10 more times.
Jackson, you do not see, just in general, a lot of directors doing late night shows. Like usually you put the stars of the movie on late night talk shows, but especially a director who's not American. What does it say to you that to promote this movie, Bong Joon Ho has been upfront, you know, all the way sort of promoting this movie, including on places like Stephen Colbert?
I mean, talking about non-American directors, I will say Denis Villeneuve was on Colbert last year, but I mean, it is.
Yep, that's true.
CanCon, we got to get it there, but it is rare. It's not, I mean, Denis Villeneuve is also a standout, and also it is not necessarily something that we'll see non-English language fare or directors or creators kind of breaking out in the way that Bong Joon Ho has. And I mean, he himself, when Parasite won the Oscar for Best Picture, he had that, I at least think, super famous statement about the 1-inch tall barrier of subtitles and how people I think at that time were even more wary of non-English and even in a lot of cases non-American fare.
Yeah.
And I think that he really has presaged. I mean, before the show, we were talking about Blackpink, we were talking about K-pop. It's something that I do think has really shifted, and he has been that kind of, in many ways, epicenter of it. The huge success that Parasite was in America and Canada, North America in general. And I think that he has, you know, posited himself as a auteur, as somebody that can really lead really big budget fare in a way that, I mean, even actors are struggling to now. I think it was Matt Damon who said like the action lead hero or the A-lister action star is kind of dead. We don't, and Tarantino maybe said that we don't go to see movies starring Chris Evans, we go to see movies starring Captain America.
Right.
Bong Joon Ho is kind of an outlier in that sense, where like he can slap his name on a project and you're gonna be like, oh, it's a Bong Joon Ho movie. I have to see this. And I think that's kind of what that shows.
I mean, like, this is what I mean. Like this idea of the auteur, it's not like there's that many auteurs. And also they are, the idea of like a director being a household name enough for Stephen Colbert to be like, everybody welcome, you know, that there's something that sort of demands its own kind of star quality. Michelle, I'm curious to ask you how popular Bong Joon Ho is in Korea.
So he is basically a national treasure. And I think, he's somebody that is celebrated, obviously for the success that he's had in the world. You know, people in Korea really take that seriously, and they're like, oh, Bong is our world-class filmmaker. You know, he brings our representation to the world. But he has this gift of basically being able to appeal to, you know, like high-minded, highbrow kind of cinephile viewers, and also to the kind of mainstream public. So he's had a fandom for a long time, the Bong Hive, and that's like a global fandom, you know, but people in Korea are stalwart members of this fandom. So he has this kind of personality and this gentle sense of humor that also, I think, makes him such a easy figure to root for.
It's occurred to me that the statement that Jackson referenced earlier, the idea of a statement that is famous to Jackson, which is the idea of when Bong won Best Picture, he said if you just, if you just can get past the 1-inch barrier of subtitles on your screen, it will open up a whole world to you. I was like, oh, that's famous to us, like at this table.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure that we can qualify that as like famous. So I just wanted to sort of like clarify what you were referring to.
Yes,
Jackson,
fair.
let's get into Mickey 17. What do you make of this movie?
So, I mean, if we're talking about what the movie's about, it's about a guy that is what's called an expendable in the near future. He is granted the ability of immortality, kind of, in the sense that he has his memory uploaded to, computer. And then if he dies, his body can be cloned exactly as it was. And then his memories and the idea and sense of self is re-uploaded into that body. So then he ostensibly, air quotes, never dies. Well, the movie gets into some weird stuff.
It does.
And it, in this near future, for very complicated reasons, involving a psychopathic serial killer doctor, you cannot clone anyone unless they're on a space expedition, which Mickey is, and only one person on that space expedition can be cloned. No one else can do it. So then they get this one guy and they're like, oh, well, we need to figure out if there's any viruses on this planet that we're trying to colonize. Let's send Mickey down there. And he dies horribly from a virus. And we're like, bring him back. Let's try this vaccine. Doesn't work. Bring him back. And you keep doing it. And like, oh, we need to figure out, like, if you die within 10 or 20 minutes from space radiation, throw Mickey out there. Take your glove off, Mickey. So it's a bunch of gory deaths over and over again. And it's like this weird social satire where the head of this expedition is this guy, Kenneth Marshall, played by Mark Ruffalo, who is, in my opinion, this like Elon Musk meets Jim Jones type character. And he has this very strange sauce obsessed wife played by Toni Collette. There's a lot more there because I think, spoiler alert, I think this movie is a little bit messy in all of the things it tries to do, but that's kind of the closest I could define it, with, I would say, a very strong anti-capitalist message hidden somewhere beneath the folds.
Okay, I want to get to Michelle on what she thinks of the movie in just a moment, but let me just ask you real quick, what did you think of the movie? Because it sounds like you're like, some of it is working for me, but maybe not all of it is working for me.
I love my man Bong Joon Ho, and I love what he's trying to do here. But here's my deep state conspiracy theory when it relates to this movie.
Love a deep state conspiracy.
I talked about all these things this movie is going for, but I cut out, and that was kind of a long synopsis I just gave, but I cut out a ton. There's a whole thing about a macaroon business and a loan shark that I did not even get into. I'm leaving that out because we don't have time.
We don't.
And I think that there's so much in this movie that is interesting, but it's like introduced and dropped. And like there's this one part where like we introduce Mickey and then his love interest, Nasha, I believe, and they're shown to be, kindred spirits, because when Rick Marshall comes into the room, everyone claps except for those two. And like it shows that they're both kind of iconoclast, except there's another person in the background, this bald woman who very, very pointedly also does not clap. And you're like, oh, there must be like a reason for that. Who is this woman? She's so interesting. Never see her again. She's never named. At the very end of the movie, in the background, she's seen as dating a secondary antagonist, which I think, deep state conspiracy theory, there was a whole other movie embedded in this movie. There's a 4.5-hour Bong Joon Ho cut that was one of the reasons this movie was delayed so many times. It was supposed to come out over a year ago, I think, is because he presented this movie to the studio where it's so complex, everything's finished, everything makes sense, and they're like, we cannot have this much, no one's going to see it, cut as much as you can. And he compromised and cut a lot out to try and make it more acceptable, amenable to wider audiences. When you have like 4 different plot lines and you cut 75% of all of them, you don't end up with one whole movie, you end up with a whole mess. And I kind of think that's what happened here.
Okay, so Jackson's like, some of this is working, but maybe it would have been nice to see the full movie at work. Michelle, is that your experience of this movie? You watch this movie and kind of go like, we were trying for too much and it feels like too much of it is missing. Or did it work for you?
So I had a blast. It was so entertaining. And so, actually, so Jackson and I think are really good representatives of the reaction that this film is getting. It's very polarized, actually. I think that I like maximalist Bong, and so I'm like willing to kind of just go for the ride, and I'm not too concerned when kind of things get dropped and stuff. but it's because I kind of, you know, I had fun the whole time, even though the three acts of this film kind of feel like they could all be separate movies.
Yeah.
And so there's a disjointed quality to it, which is kind of wacky and zany. I mean, it's like truly the kind of definition of zaniness in a lot of moments. And I mean, that's kind of Bong in this modality of like, you know, I'm making a kind of film that stars, you know, well-known Hollywood actors, and I'm working in English.
Yeah.
I mean, he challenges himself in general, in kind of how do I make a mashup that will work, but kind of teetering on the edge. You know, it's
Right.
like he wants to surprise and kind of push forms to their limits. And, you know, I mean, remember, Parasite felt like a movie that you knew until it turned into a totally different movie, you know, and,
Yes, it did.
but that worked, you know, and
Yes.
so that is his kind of signature in certain ways. So I don't know, it works better in certain of his attempts than others. So I'll give him that for sure. And so I understand why a lot of people are critical of Mickey 17, because it's kind of like, you know, too many things. It's like a bunch of, you know, I don't know, like rats trying to escape some sort of cage. It can like run in many different directions.
Well,
But I don't know. I think that that's also like fun for a lot of it. And so, yeah, I really loved it.
Yeah, Jackson, it's fun. Okay, no, Michelle, I wanna I wanna ask you, Michelle, about something that Jackson brought up earlier, about this idea of like the character that Mark Ruffalo plays here, the villain,
Yeah.
is sort of this like egomaniacal politician. You know, some people have kind of made the connection between that character and Donald Trump. Bong Joon Ho himself has said like this character is not based on Donald Trump, that he wrote and shot the movie well before Trump was in office again. And then this came up when Bong was talking to Tom Power, and so Tom asked him about this, and then here's what Bong had to say.
어떻게 보면 그런 게 사이파이 영화를 찍는 이유이기도 하다라는 생각이 들더라고요. 그러니까 사이파이 먼 미래 얘기를 찍는.
I just thought that, you know, this is probably why we love sci-fi and I make sci-fi films. You know, sci-fi, it seems like you're telling a story about far into the future, about outer space, a different universe, but actually through these stories, you get to reflect on the now.
Michelle, I'm interested in the idea that, you know, he makes movies that sort of let us reflect on the now, because obviously he's interested in class. It's sort of a recurring theme and recurring focal point of his work. Not just Parasite, not just this movie and the idea of an expendable being the central character, but of course Snowpiercer, or even when he works in English. How do you think this movie holds up as social commentary, Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, so it's really interesting because I've seen, you know, some people being fairly critical of, you know, this idea that the Mark Ruffalo character is like a straight up Trump impression, and that, you know, this is a really like ham-fisted criticism of the way that, you know, I mean, in the film, Ruffalo is a billionaire failed politician. He's a Trump Elon Musk mashup who's taking a expedition into space, and we have, you know, SpaceX and like whatever Jeff Bezos's company is. You know, it's like there are certain things that hit too close to home. But then, you know, Bong talks about how, you know, he was referencing not them because he made this film, you know, 3 years ago. He was looking at people like the Ceausescus in Romania or the Marcoses and the Philippines. Like when you zoom out a little, you kind of get to see how this is not just a kind of on the nose, like, oh, right now it's just too clumsy because it's making fun of this contemporary reality. It's like zoom out a little and you get a sense of Bong's warning about how history repeats itself. And I just also really want to underscore that, like, a film is going to present a really different worldview when you have a director who's been living under the shadow of US hegemony for his entire life, but he is not of it, right? So there's a little bit of friction when he's given that big Hollywood studio money, but you get this really off-kilter perspective because, you know, yes, South Korea, you could arguably say, is part of, you know, the global North now, but that happened during his lifetime and it's still a really tenuous position. So his take on like an anti-colonial space sci-fi creature film is going to be really idiosyncratic and pretty unique. And that might not make sense to a lot of people, but it's because of his positionality. And I don't know. I just want to put that out there because I don't know that people are talking about that as much.
I think that's an important point to raise because, like much of his work, the statement is not all conversations have to do with social commentary about how America is unfolding, actually. And some of this is a sort of a larger global trend. Jackson, I want to give you 30 seconds to kind of wrap this up here. How do you think this movie holds up as social commentary? You got this. You can do this.
I mean, social commentary, there is aspects of capitalism and that sort of Elon Musk character. I think that's more overemphasized than it's supposed to be. I think this is more about, how society can use up and grind up its employees. I mean, this guy who's literally his life is what he is selling. And then underneath that, there's this very strong idea about like letting go and grief, this memory about pressing this red button that ends up killing his mom. And then also on top of that, the whole idea of Toni Collette's character obsessed with sauce is the true litmus test of society and like, upper crust and all those ideas are there. But I mean, going back to the beginning, Parasite and even Snowpiercer were so strong to say that it's such clear metaphors. Snowpiercer literally going forwards in the class system, the train going forward. Parasite, idea of class and is represented in the Scholar's Rock. But I think if Mickey 17 was similar, like the Scholar's Rock specifically in Parasite, if that was brought up and then never introduced again, is kind of what Mickey 17 does. There's a lot of interesting ideas there. They're not necessarily finished, but there's something strong in the depths, and I understand why people find it fun.
What I like about you is if I said 30 seconds, you're going to take a minute, and I love that about you. Okay, I appreciate you guys are both the best. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your energy. This has been great. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. Talk to you soon. Michelle Cho is a professor with the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Toronto. Jackson Weaver is a reporter with CBC Entertainment. And by the way, you can catch Tom's interview with Bong Joon Ho on the Q podcast. Mickey 17 is out in theaters right now. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Okay, look, I know that you've seen Law & Order. It's something that the show has been doing forever, is just pulling stories from the headlines and figuring out how to incorporate that into an episode. And you can see this at work in the season 2 premiere of Law & Order Toronto. The episode is called White Squirrel City, and the backdrop of that episode is the issue of homelessness in Toronto. This is an episode that is in some ways pulling directly from some real-life events, like Toronto's encampment evictions and the murder of an encampment resident. Michael DeForge is here. He just wrote about this episode. He's a Toronto illustrator who has been advocating against encampment evictions. Michael, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yes, of course. Nice to have you back. Listen, before we get into it, let's just talk about just the storyline of this episode. Can you just give us a quick synopsis of what this episode is about?
Yeah, I won't go through the breakdown of every single kind of red herring they go through, which is the typical Law and Order formula, but they start the episode with an encampment resident who is stabbed to death by a group of teenagers. That is clearly a reference to the murder of Kenneth Lee in 2022. Encampment that it takes place in is clearly supposed to evoke the Trinity Bellwoods encampment, especially how it looked in 2021, which was subject to militarized police evictions in 2021 that got quite a lot of headlines and scrutiny at the time.
So you're an illustrator, and you made a sign that I now see everywhere in the city. A lot of Toronto residents just have it up in their window and their lawn. It says, "I support my neighbors in tents, no encampment evictions." Again, I see these signs all over the city. Law and Order reaches out to you. They say, "Hey, we want to use your sign in this episode." You turned them down. Can you tell me why?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a Law and Order watcher, but I'm also just generally uninterested in propaganda, which is sort of the term used for media that tries to paint cops as benevolent, well-intentioned forces, which Law and Order is one of the prime culprits for. So I was uninterested, and also it's work I created for Encampment Support Network. It was an organization that was operating in 2021 that I was a big supporter of. I became an organizer and member of Encampment Support Network Parkdale for a few years in 2022. And I also think of this as work I made for the movement, not for a commercial TV show to use.
Having said that, a version of the signs that you created still do, in fact, show up in this episode. Did you expect for that to happen?
I kind of anticipated it. Yeah, there's a lookalike that shows up in the episode, and the character has a sign that says, "I stand with my unhoused neighbors." And I'll say, it shows up very Briefly, this is not something I personally care about that much, like the use of my sign.
Yeah.
When the episode was being filmed, it was being filmed in Bickford Park. And in the final episode, and also just visiting the set of the sort of fake TV encampment they set up at Bickford Park, what I did find quite appalling is the way the set was dressed. It was dressed with a lot of graffiti that was clearly using the visual reference points of the actual 2021 Trinity Bellwoods encampment. And that included both signage from ESN, Encampment Support Network, but especially included artwork by a resident of the encampment at the time named Jay the Letter. And when you kind of do a cursory Google of 2021 Trinity Bellwoods encampment, you'll find stuff about the White Squirrel Brigade and Bruce Lee City, which are like the colloquialisms given to the encampment there. And you'll find an article on BlogTO talking about Jay the Letter, this graffiti artist, at the time being the mayor of Bruce Lee City. And in this episode that takes place in this fictional White Squirrel City, the encampment resident murdered is the mayor of White Squirrel City. Jay the Letter, he now has housing, but he's this incredibly talented artist, and they are using and I assume it just happened because they were doing a cursory Google and tossing on their mood board, the writer's room and the production designers on the show. They're taking his real life and his traumas and his artwork. After he was evicted too, a year later, Freedom of Information reports showed that he was amongst encampment residents who were actually surveyed by Toronto police. They built up a dossier on them, and there were files on Jay the Letter. So I just want to also emphasize how particularly tacky and tasteless it is to use this real person's life and artwork and very violence against him, and just to have it show up as set dressing in a TV show.
I mean, there's the number of borrowings, so let's say, from real life is quite striking when you sort of think about the construction of this episode. When you think about the story, you think about this episode and the way that it's shown, how do you think shows like Law and Order and their sort of these attempts sort of bring in real life and real life events that people are sort of familiar with from headlines? How do you think an episode like this one might shape how people view, just in general, the issue of homelessness and how people maybe view unhoused people?
So this episode does something that a lot of popular media does, which is on the surface have a depiction of homelessness that might seem sympathetic. Like they know not to just outright demonize unhoused people. But what's actually going on is a little more insidious, because in this case, it treats the idea of homelessness, or specifically homeless death, as a very individualized problem versus a material societal problem. So a very good example in this episode, they have one character talk about the reason someone might be experiencing homelessness. And she says, people think that it's laziness or lifestyle, but sometimes it's just plain old grief. And a line like that is clearly trying to gesture towards some sort of progressive stance on being unhoused. But what it's actually doing is obscuring the reasons people are sleeping outdoors. And those reasons aren't just a series of personal traumas and personal tragedies. In reality, it's social causes like rampant housing speculation, a failure from municipal, provincial, and federal governments to adequately provide housing for people. And in the context of Law and Order, when we're talking about homeless death, the social causes of homeless death are cops, like the cops that are depicted in Law and Order, and city workers who harass and assault and survey unhoused people and violently evict them and take away their homes and destroy their possessions. State policies of austerity, it's cut social services and supports, it's policies that ban unhoused people from public life, it's endless wait times in central intake. And when we talk about it, just to put it in the scale of it, in perspective, there's been a 25% increase in homelessness in Ontario since 2022. The median age of death for unhoused women has dropped from 43 to 36 in 2023. So this is what I mean when I talk about this is social murder, and it's murder orchestrated by very specific policies that we don't get Law and Order episodes about.
Michael, I think that is a good place to leave it. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being on the show today and for talking about this episode with me. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, of course. Michael DeForge is a comedic writer and illustrator from Ottawa. You can catch that Law & Order Toronto episode on CTV. Make up your mind. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We'll see you tomorrow.